My 28th birthday cake was a store-bought vanilla sheet, left sweating in its plastic clamshell on the kitchen counter. I never got to eat it. Instead, I got a circle of metal folding chairs, 6 printed letters of concern, and the night I orphaned myself by choice. The drive to my parents' house in the suburbs always felt like moving backward through time, an involuntary regression measured in highway exits and the gradual thinning of streetlights. It was a Tuesday in late November. The sky was the color of a bruised knee, spitting a mix of sleet and freezing rain that made my windshield wipers grind with a rhythmic, rubbery squeal. I didn't want to go. I was 28, entirely exhausted, and my boots were still damp from my shift at the print shop. But it was my birthday. My mother, Susan, had called 3 times that morning, her voice pitched in that specific, forced cheerfulness that usually meant she was masking a grievance. "Just a quiet family dinner, Claire. Lasagna. Don't be late. Your father bought a good Chianti." When I unlocked the heavy oak front door of my childhood home, the first thing that hit me was the heat. My father kept the thermostat at a suffocating 74 degrees all winter. The air felt thick, smelling intensely of lemon pledge, stale cinnamon potpourri, and the faint, dusty exhaust of the baseboard heaters. I kicked off my boots in the foyer, my socks absorbing a patch of melted snow on the runner rug. "I'm here," I called out, my voice muffled by the heavy drapes and overstuffed furniture of the hallway. There was no music playing. Usually, my dad would have some low-volume jazz station humming from the kitchen radio. Today, the house possessed a heavy, acoustic deadness. I could hear the rhythmic tock-tock-tock of the grandfather clock in the den, a sound I hadn't actively noticed since I was a teenager. My mother appeared from the kitchen archway. She was wearing her good beige slacks and a silk blouse, a string of pearls resting against her collarbone. Her lipstick was a harsh matte red, slightly bleeding into the fine lines around her mouth. She didn't have an apron on. There was no smell of roasting garlic, no simmering tomatoes. "Claire," she said. Her voice was breathy, tight. She stepped forward and hugged me, but she didn't lean in. It was a rigid, geometric collision of shoulders. She smelled overpoweringly of Chanel No. 5 in nervous sweat, a sharp, metallic odor hiding just beneath the floral perfume. "Where's the lasagna?" I asked, attempting a half smile. I unspooled my wet scarf from my neck. "In a minute," she said, her eyes darting past me, over my shoulder, toward the living room. "Come in. Everyone's waiting." Everyone. I followed her. The carpet under my feet was thick, a synthetic beige that always made my skin itch if I sat on it too long. As I rounded the corner into the sunken living room, the scene laid out before me didn't register right away. The brain takes a few seconds to process absurdity. The heavy mahogany coffee table had been shoved against the far wall. In its place, arranged in a deliberate, suffocating semicircle, were 5 chairs. 2 were the upholstered wingbacks from the study. 3 were the rusted metal folding chairs my dad kept in the basement for holiday overflow. Sitting in the wingbacks were my sister, Ellie, and her husband, Greg. Ellie was 6 months pregnant, currently rubbing the swell of her stomach with a slow, performative rhythm. Greg wore his standard finance bro fleece vest over a checkered button-down, his face a mask of practiced boardroom solemnity. In one of the folding chairs sat my father, Richard. He was staring down into a rocks glass filled with amber, liquid, and heavy, cloudy ice cubes. He didn't look up when I walked in. In the folding chair next to him sat Rachel. My stomach dropped, a sudden, cold freefall behind my ribs. Rachel was my best friend from college. Or she had been, until a slow, agonizing fade-out over the past 6 months after I finally stopped loaning her money and listening to her endless, cyclical rants about her married boss. I hadn't spoken to her in 6 weeks. Seeing her here in my parents' suburban living room, wearing a chunky knit sweater and an expression of deep, tragic concern, made the hairs on my arms stand up. "What is this?" I asked. My voice sounded small, thin in the large room. My mother bypassed the semicircle and pulled a wooden dining chair from the corner, placing it dead center, facing the others. The hot seat. "Sit down, Claire," my mother said. She took the last folding chair, completing the arc. I didn't move. My wet socks were freezing, but sweat was beginning to prickle at the nape of my neck. I looked at the coffee table pushed against the wall. On it sat a plastic grocery store clamshell containing a vanilla sheet cake with Happy 28th Claire written in sloppy blue icing. Next to it was a stack of printer paper. "Is this a joke?" I asked, looking at my father. He took a sip of his scotch, the ice clinking against the glass, a sharp, violent sound in the quiet room. "We love you, Claire," Ellie said softly from her wing-back chair. Her tone was the one you use on a skittish dog. "We're here because we love you." "Are you staging an intervention?" A rough, cynical laugh tore out of my throat before I could stop it. "For what?" "I don't do drugs. I barely drink. I work at a print shop and paint watercolors in a studio apartment." "What exactly are you intervening on?" "Your life, Claire," my mother said. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. The knuckles were white. "Your life has become unmanageable, and it is destroying this family." I looked at the wooden chair positioned for me. The finish on the seat was worn down from years of family dinners. I felt a bizarre, detached curiosity override my fight-or-flight instinct. I walked over and sat down. The wood was cold. I crossed my legs, folding my hands over my knee to hide the sudden tremor in my fingers. "Okay," I said, my voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold, flat register. "Go ahead." My mother reached beside her chair and picked up a thick piece of cardstock. The fact that she had printed this out, that she was holding a physical script, made my jaw lock. "Claire," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured gravity, "we are here today because we can no longer stand by and watch you self-destruct." I stared at her. She was wearing her reading glasses, the thin, tortoiseshell ones she usually reserved for balancing the checkbook. 2 years ago, she read, her finger tracing the line on the paper, "You threw away a law degree that cost your father and me a significant portion of our retirement savings. You dropped out of a prestigious firm 3 months before you were up for associate. You moved out of a beautiful townhouse and into a dilapidated apartment in a neighborhood where I am afraid to park my car." "The firm made me suicidal, Mom," I said, my tone conversational, devoid of the hysterics she was clearly braced for. "I told you that." "I was sleeping 3 hours a night and throwing up in the office bathrooms." "Please do not interrupt," Greg chimed in. He shifted in his seat, the nylon of his fleece vest scratching loudly against itself. "This is Susan's time to share." I whipped my head toward my brother-in-law. "Greg, you literally asked me if you could expense a pack of gum on my birthday card last year. Do not moderate my mother." Greg's face flushed a dull, patchy red, but he clamped his mouth shut. My mother cleared her throat loudly. "As I was saying, you abandoned your career. You abandoned your financial stability. You have alienated your family by refusing to attend Thanksgiving because you said you, quote, couldn't deal with the energetic toll, unquote. You invited Uncle Terry, who spent the previous Thanksgiving explaining to me why women shouldn't be allowed to have bank accounts," I pointed out, staring at the ceiling for a fraction of a second. The popcorn texture of the plaster looked like hundreds of tiny, frozen maggots. "Family is family," my mother snapped, her composure cracking slightly, the raw, controlling anger bleeding through the therapeutic language. She took a deep breath, smoothing the paper. "But worst of all, Claire, you abandoned your future. You threw away a perfectly good, loving relationship with a man who was ready to give you the world for absolutely no reason." Ah, there it was, the bleeding heart of the issue. I looked at my father. He was staring firmly at his knees, his jaw tight. I looked at Ellie. She gave me a sad, pitying look, tilting her head so her perfectly curled hair cascaded over her shoulder. "And Rachel?" I asked, turning my gaze to my former friend. She was twisting a silver ring on her thumb, over and over, the metal catching the dull light of the table lamp. "Why are you here?" "To tell them how I ruined my life by not answering your 2 a.m. phone calls when your boss wouldn't leave his wife?" Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Claire, I am here because I care about you, because you isolate yourself. You cut people off the second they aren't perfect. I cut you off because you stole $300 from my dresser to pay for your Botox, Rachel." Silence fell over the room. heavy, suffocating, choking silence. The grandfather clock ticked. Talk, talk, talk. My mother looked horrified, but not at Rachel. At me, for saying it out loud, for breaking the polite suburban veneer of the ambush. "This isn't about Rachel," Ellie interrupted, her voice sharp. She struggled to sit forward, her pregnant belly pressing against her thighs. She pulled a piece of folded pink stationery from her pocket. "This is about you, Claire. Can I read mine now?" "By all means," I said, leaning back in the hard wooden chair. The muscles in my back were locked tight, vibrating like plucked wire. I felt entirely untethered from reality. This was a tribunal. A firing squad convened in the living room where I used to watch Saturday morning cartoons. Ellie unfolded the pink paper. "Dear Claire, growing up, I always looked up to you. You were driven, you were smart, but over the last 2 years, I feel like I've lost my sister. You're unmoored. You work a menial job. You refuse to settle down. When I tell my friends about you, I don't even know what to say anymore. It's embarrassing." The word hung in the air. Embarrassing. The dry heat of the room was beginning to make me feel nauseous. A dull throb started at the base of my skull. It wasn't the accusations themselves that hurt. I had heard versions of these complaints passive-aggressively muttered over coffee cups for 2 years. What hurt was the coordination. The fact that my mother, my father, my pregnant sister, her dull husband, and my parasitic ex-best friend had formed a group chat, that they had scheduled a date, that they had bought a grocery store cake to use as bait, that my father had carried folding chairs up from the basement specifically to sit in judgment of my life. They didn't think I was sick. They didn't think I was in danger. They were just deeply, profoundly offended that my life didn't look the way they wanted it to. I was an embarrassment to their aesthetic. I looked down at my hands. There was a faint smudge of cobalt blue ink on my left thumb from the risograph machine at work. I rubbed it, feeling the dry friction of my own skin. "Is that it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are we done? Can I leave?" "No," my father said. It was the first time he had spoken since I walked in. His voice was gravelly, rusted from disuse. He finally looked up from his glass. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from the scotch or the stress, I couldn't tell. "We have one more person who wanted to speak to you," my dad said. I frowned, my brow furrowing. "Who?" Right on cue, the front doorbell chimed. A bright, cheerful, 2-note electronic sound that violently pierced the heavy tension in the living room. Ding dong. No. A cold electric shock of pure adrenaline ripped through my nervous system. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a sudden metallic taste flooded my mouth. "Dad," I warned, my voice losing its flat detachment. Panic, sharp and jagged, edged into my tone. "Dad, who is at the door?" My father didn't answer. He just stood up, setting his scotch glass down on the side table. The ice gave one last, soft clink. He walked out of the living room, disappearing into the foyer. I heard the heavy oak door open. I heard the murmur of male voices. Low, cordial. Then I smelled it. Even before he rounded the corner, the scent drifted into the room on the draft from the open front door. Sandalwood, bergamot, and expensive dry cleaning fluid. I gripped the sides of the wooden chair so hard my fingernails bit into the palm of my own hand. David walked into the room. He looked exactly the same. He wore a tailored navy wool peacoat over a charcoal turtleneck. His dark hair was perfectly styled, just the right amount of effortless wave. He carried himself with that same infuriating, gravitational pull, the kind of quiet, arrogant confidence that commanded a room without having to raise its voice. He looked at my mother and gave her a warm, tragic smile. He nodded at Ellie and Greg. Then his eyes landed on me, sitting in the center of the room in my damp socks and oversized sweater. "Hi, Claire," he said. His voice was smooth, a rich baritone that made my stomach physically revolt. I didn't say hi. I didn't say anything. I felt my lungs seize up. I literally stopped breathing. I had ended my engagement to David 8 months ago. To my family, it had looked like sudden insanity. He was a junior partner at a wealth management firm. He bought me a 2-carat diamond. He remembered my mother's birthday and golfed with my father. On paper, he was the architectural blueprint of the perfect son-in-law. Off paper, David was a psychological tourniquet. It was never physical. It was a million tiny, invisible cuts. It was the way he would slowly hide my things, my keys, my favorite mug, my sketching pencils, watch me frantically tear the apartment apart looking for them, and then place them right out in the open, looking at me with deep concern, asking if my memory was slipping again. It was the way he would gently, lovingly critique my weight, my clothes, my friends, until I was terrified to leave the house without his approval. It was the nights I spent crying on the bathroom floor while he sat on the couch watching ESPN, turning the volume up so he didn't have to hear me. When I left him, I didn't tell my parents the details. I knew they wouldn't believe me. David had spent 3 years charming them, laying the groundwork, establishing himself as the sane, steady rock to my emotional artist archetype. If I told them he was gaslighting me, they would have said I was being dramatic. So I just said I didn't love him anymore. And now, here he was, standing in my parents' living room, clutching a piece of folded stationery. "What is he doing here?" I asked, looking directly at my mother. My voice was no longer flat. It was trembling with a rage so pure and hot it felt like a physical weight in my chest. "David reached out to us," my mother said defensively, though she avoided my eyes. "He was worried about you. He cares about you, Claire. He wanted to be part of your healing." "My healing," I repeated, tasting bile at the back of my throat. David stepped forward. He didn't sit down. He stood over me, looking down with an expression of profound, sickening pity. "Claire," he started, unfolding his paper. "Don't," I snapped. I pointed a shaking finger at him. "Do not read that. Do not speak to me." "Claire, please," David said, his voice dropping to a gentle, soothing register. The voice he used when he was convincing me I was crazy. "I'm not here to attack you. I'm here because I miss the girl I fell in love with. The girl who was ambitious. The girl who had a light in her eyes." He paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with my family to ensure he had his audience. He did. They were eating it up. Ellie was literally wiping a tear from her eye. "When you left me," David continued, looking back down at me, it broke my heart. But it wasn't just losing you. It was watching you lose yourself. You walked away from everything we built because you were scared. You self-sabotaged. You pushed me away because I saw your potential, and that terrified you. I stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was paralyzing. He was standing in my childhood home, rewriting the history of my survival into a narrative of my mental collapse, and my family was nodding along. I looked at my father. "Dad, tell him to leave." My father shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor. "Just listen to him, Claire. He used to lock me out of our apartment on winter nights when he was angry." "Dad!" I yelled, the volume of my own voice shocking me. The sound bounced off the plaster walls. He would deadbolt the door and turn off his phone, and I would have to sit in the hallway for hours. I looked around the room. I expected shock. I expected outrage. Instead, I saw my mother grimace, a tight, pinched expression of distaste. "Claire, please, don't invent things just to deflect from your own behavior. David told us you've been having these paranoid episodes." The room tilted. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears, drowning out the ticking of the grandfather clock. Paranoid episodes. I looked at David. A microscopic, triumphant smirk twitched at the corner of his mouth. It was so fast, so subtle, no one else could have caught it. But I did. He had won. He had gotten to them first. He had spent the last 8 months tending to the garden of my family's disappointment, planting seeds of my instability, watering them with his fake concern. "He told you I was crazy," I said, my voice dropping back down to a whisper. The anger suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness that stretched down to my marrow. "And you believed him." "We believe that you are unwell, honey," my mother said softly, "and we have a plan. We found a beautiful inpatient facility in upstate New York for burnout, For depression, Greg has graciously offered to cover the deposit. Greg puffed out his chest slightly, adjusting his fleece vest. It's a holistic wellness center, Claire. Lots of yoga, equine therapy. You need a reset. I looked at all of them. 6 people. My mother, who cared more about how my life looked on a Christmas card than whether I was actually surviving it. My father, a coward who would rather drown in scotch than stand up to his wife. My sister, entirely consumed by her own reflection, desperate for someone to look down on. Greg, a walking spreadsheet who bought his way into a family's good graces. Rachel, a parasite who couldn't stand that I had finally detached from her host body. And David, the architect of my misery, standing there like a savior. 6 relationships. 6 threads holding me to the concept of a home. I felt the sudden, distinct sensation of a cord snapping in my chest. It didn't hurt. In fact, it was the most profound, weightless relief I had ever experienced. I stood up. The wooden chair scraped harshly against the carpet. Everyone flinched slightly, bracing for the explosion. They were waiting for me to scream, to cry, to throw a tantrum that would validate every single word they had printed on their heavy cardstock. David stepped back, his posture defensive, ready to play the victim of my instability. But I didn't scream. I just looked at the store-bought vanilla cake on the coffee table. The blue icing was starting to sweat and bleed into the white frosting. "I'm going to leave now," I said. The silence that followed my announcement wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. "Claire, sit down," my mother commanded. The therapeutic, gentle tone evaporated instantly, replaced by the sharp, brittle bark she used when a waitress got her order wrong. "You are being irrational. We are not finished." "I am," I said. I didn't storm out. There was no dramatic heel turn, no cinematic flinging of a scarf over my shoulder. Storming out implies a loss of control, an emotional overflow that they could point to and say, "See? She's hysterical." Instead, I walked toward the foyer with the slow, deliberate, heavy-footedness of someone wading through waist-deep water. My wet socks made a soft, squelching sound against the hardwood floor as I stepped off the living room carpet. David was the first to move. He intercepted me in the hallway, stepping directly into my path. He blocked the front door, his broad shoulders easily eclipsing the heavy oak frame. "Don't do this, Claire," he murmured, his voice dropping into that infuriatingly calm, reasonable register. He reached out, his warm, dry fingers wrapping around my forearm. The physical contact sent a jolt of pure, white-hot revulsion straight to my nervous system. "Let go of me," I said. I didn't yell. I looked down at his hand, then up at his eyes. "If you ever touch me again, David, I will scream so loudly the neighbors will call the police, and then I will tell them exactly why I left you. I will tell them everything." His grip faltered. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. The tragic, concerned ex-boyfriend vanished, and I saw the cold, furious calculation beneath. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering under the skin of his cheek. He let go of my arm and took a half step back, just enough for me to pass. I reached for my boots. They were still damp, the leather stiff and unyielding from the freezing rain. I shoved my feet into them, my fingers fumbling with the wet laces. I was shaking now, a deep, internal tremor that started in my chest and vibrated down to my wrists. I dropped my keys on the runner rug. They landed with a heavy, metallic clatter. I cursed silently, bending over to retrieve them. It was a clumsy, undignified moment. I felt the collective weight of their stares burning into my back. "If you walk out that door, Claire, you are making a choice." My mother's voice rang out from the living room archway. She was standing there with her arms crossed over her silk blouse, her face pale and furious. "We are offering you a lifeline. If you refuse it, do not expect us to catch you when you finally hit rock bottom. We won't pay your rent. We won't bail you out." "You don't pay my rent now, Mom," I said, finally righting myself, keys clutched in my fist. "I make $15 an hour at a print shop. I buy my own groceries. I pay my own bills. I am entirely, completely unattached from your bank account. That's what actually scares you. Claire, be reasonable, Greg chimed in, his voice whiny and thin from behind my mother. I already put a $5,000 non-refundable deposit down on the wellness center. I let out a short, hollow laugh that scraped my throat raw. I guess you'll just have to go do equine therapy yourself, Greg. Give the horse my best. I looked past my mother, past the heavily pregnant, sobbing silhouette of my sister, past Rachel, who was furiously texting on her phone, probably updating her other friends about my breakdown, and searched for my father. He was still sitting in the folding chair, staring at the floor. Dad, I said, my voice cracked. Just once. The only crack in the armor. He looked up. His eyes met mine. For a second, I saw a flicker of recognition. A ghost of the man who used to teach me how to parallel park, who used to put band-aids on my scraped knees, who used to whisper, "Don't tell your mother," when he slipped me a $20 bill. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to tell David to get the hell out of his house. He swallowed hard, looked away, and reached for his scotch glass. That was it, the final thread snapping. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt, gripped the cold handle, and pulled the door open. The freezing November wind rushed into the sweltering house, smelling of wet asphalt and dead leaves. It hit my face like a physical blow, shocking me back into my body. I stepped out into the sleet and pulled the door shut behind me. It latched with a heavy, definitive click. My car was a 2011 Honda Civic parked halfway down the street, its passenger side mirror held together by a web of cloudy packing tape. By the time I reached it, the freezing rain had soaked through the shoulders of my oversized sweater. I grabbed the frozen metal of the door handle, yanked it open, and threw myself into the driver's seat. The vinyl was rock hard and painfully cold. I slammed the door shut, instantly cutting off the howling wind, replacing it with the muffled, rhythmic drumming of sleet against the roof. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. It clicked, whined a pathetic, high-pitched metallic grind, and failed to turn over. Panic, sharp and entirely unphilosophical, seized my throat. Please, not now. Do not let me break down on their street. I could picture it perfectly. David walking out with an umbrella, tapping on my window, offering to call a tow truck with that insufferable, pitying smile. My mother standing in the doorway, shaking her head at my inability to maintain basic vehicle maintenance. I pumped the gas pedal twice, gripped the freezing steering wheel with both hands, and turned the key again, holding my breath. The engine sputtered, caught, and roared to life with a violent, rattling hum. I threw it in drive and accelerated a little too hard. The tires spun, slipping on the slick pavement for a terrifying second before catching traction. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes fixed on the sweeping arcs of the windshield wipers, dragging rubber across the glass with a heavy, squealing friction. The drive back toward the city was a slow, involuntary decompression. The adrenaline that had spiked in that suffocating living room began to drain from my bloodstream, leaving behind a profound physical ache. My jaw throbbed from how hard I'd been clenching my teeth. The heater in the Civic took 10 minutes to blow anything warmer than tepid air, and when it finally kicked in, it smelled sharply of burning dust and old motor oil. I needed a buffer. I couldn't carry the psychic residue of that house straight into my apartment. I pulled over at a bleak, fluorescent-lit gas station just past the county line. The light bleeding out from the large glass windows looked sickly against the wet, black asphalt. The bell on the door let out a weak, tinny jingle as I walked in. The air inside was stale, smelling aggressively of artificial cherry air freshener, floor wax, and the scorched remnants of rolling hot dog grease. It was entirely empty, save for a kid behind the counter, wearing a faded blue polo. He had a brutal case of acne and didn't even look up from the glow of his phone as I walked past. It was the most comforting interaction I'd had all day. Total, unapologetic indifference. I walked to the back corner, grabbed a flimsy styrofoam cup, and filled it with whatever was left in the carafe marked dark roast. The liquid was thick, sludgy, and black as tar. I paid the kid with 3 crumpled dollar bills. He slid 2 quarters across the counter without a word. Back in my idling car, I sat under the harsh, yellow glare of a street lamp. I took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like battery acid and burnt pennies, and it scalded the roof of my mouth. It was perfect. It grounded me, pulling me out of my head and back into my physical body. I dug into the center console and pulled out a faded grocery receipt and a blue ballpoint pen. Pressing the paper against the center of the steering wheel, I wrote. I didn't know why I was doing it, only that I needed to document the wreckage before my brain tried to convince me I had overreacted. David, Susan, Richard, Ellie, Greg, Rachel. 6 names, 6 relationships, 6 thick, fibrous tethers to the concept of a home and a future, neatly severed in the span of 20 minutes over a grocery store sheet cake. I stared at the blue ink on the crumpled thermal paper. The grief didn't arrive gracefully. It hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against the cold, hard plastic of the steering wheel, and I cried. It was an ugly, breathless crying. My chest heaved, my nose ran, and I wiped my face frantically with the rough, wet wool of my sleeve. I cried for the father who used to teach me how to parallel park but chose to drown in a glass of scotch rather than defend me. I cried for the sister who needed my failure to validate her own hollow choices. And I cried for the version of myself who had been so terrified of being alone that she almost married a man who treated her sanity like a chess piece. I sat there for 20 minutes, letting the engine rumble beneath me, until the tears stopped and my eyes burned. I finished the terrible coffee. It was lukewarm now. I put the car in gear and drove the rest of the way. My apartment building was a brick walk-up, sandwiched between a bodega and a dry cleaner. The hallway always smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. My boots felt like lead weights as I dragged myself up the 3 flights of stairs. When I unlocked my door and pushed it open, the apartment was pitch black and freezing. I flipped the light switch. It was a studio, barely 400 square feet. The bed was a mattress on a cheap metal frame. Canvases were stacked haphazardly against the far wall, creating a chaotic, makeshift hallway. The kitchen counter was buried under a pile of mail, dirty mugs, and watercolor tins. It wasn't a corner office. It wasn't a pristine suburban home. The paint on the ceiling was peeling, and the faucet in the bathroom sink had a permanent, syncopated drip. I locked the deadbolt and slid the heavy brass chain into its track. I towed off my wet boots, leaving them to puddle on the linoleum by the door, and peeled off my damp socks. The exposed wood floorboards were gritty and freezing against my bare feet. I walked over to the cast iron radiator beneath the single-pane window. It was hissing gently, radiating a dry, localized pocket of heat into the cold room. I sat down on the faded, worn rug right next to it. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs, and leaned my head back against the plaster wall. The air in the room smelled like linseed oil, cheap lavender soap, and old dust. It was messy. It was lonely. I looked at the digital clock glowing green on the stove across the room. It was 11:52 p.m. In 8 minutes, my 28th birthday would be over. I didn't have a cake. I didn't have a fiancé or a best friend or a family who knew how to love me without demanding a receipt. But as I sat there, listening to the drip of the faucet and the rattle of the sleet against the glass, a strange, creeping sensation began to spread through my ribs. It started small, expanding outward, filling the empty spaces left behind by the grief. It was space, massive, terrifying, brilliant space. There was no one left to manage, no one left to placate, no one left to convince that I was sane or capable or worthy of baseline respect. The silence in the apartment wasn't the heavy, suffocating deadness of my parents' living room. It was a blank canvas. I took a deep breath. The air went all the way down into my lungs. There was no tightness, no bracing for an invisible blow. It was an imperfect, gritty, entirely solitary freedom. But as the clock ticked over to midnight, I realized the air in this tiny, freezing apartment belonged entirely to me. If you've ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you just to protect yourself, I see you. Healing isn't always pretty. Sometimes it looks like sitting on a cold floor, entirely alone, and finally being able to breathe. If Claire's story resonated with you, hit the like button, share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, grounded storytelling. See you in the next one.